Chapter 12 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. How Ivan ever reached home that night without being arrested by the police on suspicion of being drunk, he never afterwards could say. He remembered nothing after the time when, out of Greta Ottlinger's confused babble, he had gleaned the name of Grünebaum, the name that to him at last meant absolute salvation. He knew the shop well on the open ring, kept by old Moses Grünebaum, and containing a wonderful collection of antique jewellery, furniture, and curios of all kinds, a shop much frequented by connoisseurs, the most thought of in Vienna, in fact, for that class of things, certainly not one that would ever fall under suspicion of harbouring stolen goods. It was obviously too late to interview old Moses at that hour of the night. Ivan, though hardly alive to any outward facts, save the all-absorbing one, was nevertheless conscious of that, and instinct guided his reeling footsteps to the hotel on the Kolovatring. A mass of letters awaited him, correspondence he was sadly neglecting in these days of anxiety. One of them was from His Eminence. Ivan tore it open in eager excitement. It ran as follows. Klinger's Hotel, Marienbad, 28th February. My dear son, you will see by the above address that I have altered my plans and am staying here for the present. The fresh mountain air is having a most beneficial effect upon my health, and I shall probably stay, D.V., the full length of my intended holiday. I hope you are getting on satisfactorily with the work fast enough to enable you to take some days' rest before we once more meet at St Petersburg for diplomatic business. By the way, if you should happen to get there before I do, I think it would be well if you would call on Madame Demidoff and ask her to hand you over the Emperor's candlesticks, which then could remain in your charge. I hope she accomplished her journey in safety, and that not the slightest harm has come to those tiresome things, which very nearly succeeded in depriving me of my holiday. I assure you, my dear son, when I think of all the enjoyment I should have missed on their account, I am doubly grateful to Madame for the kind favour she has done me. My apostolic blessings on you, my son, and sincere respect to Madame Demidoff when you see her. Antonius D'Orsay, Cardinal, Archbishop. Walensky put down the letter. A sigh of complete relief came from his heart. Thank heaven, His Eminence knew nothing. It was not to be wondered at. The robbery at Oderberg had not created much comment in the press, owing to the speedy capture of the thief, and it would have been nothing but the most adverse coincidence if His Eminence, who, to Ivan's knowledge, never glanced at a newspaper, should that one day of all days have seen the two numbers that contained an account of the theft. He knew from his own experience that the facts were not sufficiently mysterious to excite public interest, and as His Eminence's name had not once been mentioned by Madame Demidoff, it was not very likely that the Cardinal would hear of the matter from any outside source. Madame evidently did not mean that His Eminence should hear about her loss. That was only natural. No one likes to own to gross carelessness, least of all a lady. Oh, that he might only get rid of the fear that already she knew all, and was on the same quest as himself, backed by Russian money and Russian influence. But even then, at present, he was ahead of her. She had not interviewed Greta Ottlinger. She could not know where the candlesticks were, and before Grünebaum's shop was open the following morning he meant to be on the spot, ready to pay away all he possessed for the priceless receptacles of the secret papers. That night, as he well knew that sleep would never come to him, he spent in getting through all arrears of work for His Eminence. He meant, as soon as he had seen Grünebaum and purchased the candlesticks, to start at once for Petersburg, and deliver the papers to Teraniev. 3 days had now elapsed since the abduction of Nicholas Alexandrovich, 3 days during which Ivan, absorbed in the harrowing search for the missing messages, had not seen his comrades. Every day added one to the many dangers of discovery, and Dunajevsky and his comrades were still pining in the Moscow prisons. Oh, this burden of responsibility seemed too hard to bear. The terrors of carrying the secret papers seemed as nothing compared with what he had to undergo. But thank God, all these anxieties would be over by tomorrow at the latest. And then in his heart of hearts there first occurred to Ivan the wild longing to give up all these intrigues and plots, to be content to live the life of a quiet citizen, and leave Russian politics steadily alone. The busy night he spent acted soothingly on Ivan's nerves. He worked until the tardy winter's dawn peeped in through the curtains. Then, having refreshed himself with a bath and a good breakfast, he once more sallied forth on his quest, and 9 o'clock found him on the open ring, outside Grünebaum's shop, waiting to see the shutters taken down. The moment that was done, he stepped in and asked to see the proprietor. A snuffy old Jew with a flat nose and broad lips, with eyes like a toad's, so nearly dropping out of his head that he appeared to be wearing spectacles for the sole purpose of keeping them in the sockets, came forward, rubbing his hands benignly one against the other, evidently wondering who this very early customer could be. He was accustomed to mistrust everybody.
"A very good morning, sir, and what may I have the pleasure to show your Excellency today? Jewellery? Antiques?"
"I have come on a matter of private business," said Valensky briefly. "You had better show me into your office for your own sake." The Jew looked at him keenly for a moment from behind his spectacles, and then said suavely,
"I have no business that I should wish to conceal, but if your Excellency will take the trouble to walk this way—" and he led the way to a well-lighted, luxurious little office at the back of the shop, where a quantity of voluminous ledgers and cash-books testified to the extent and prosperity of his business. "Will your Excellency please to be seated?" he said.
"No, I prefer to stand. What I have to say won't take long. You received yesterday, at the station of the Nordbahn, a parcel of goods from a woman named Greta Ottlinger. These goods were stolen. You knew it. What have you to say?"
"That I am as innocent of this as a newborn babe, your Excellency. That I was never out of my shop all day yesterday, it being, as your Excellency no doubt will deign to remember, a very rainy day. That I never even heard of any woman named Greta Ottlinger. That I never set eyes on stolen goods. This I swear by our fathers Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and by the grave of my forefathers."
"Enough of this drivel," said Valensky impatiently. "You lie, and you know it. Now I will be brief with you. Among that stolen property—" "Don't interrupt me," he said sternly, as the Jew made another attempt at protest, and raised his hands upwards, as if calling Abraham to witness of his innocence. "I said that, among the stolen property, there was a pair of antique china and chased gold candlesticks. I wish to know where those candlesticks are. I will pay you the full amount you will have to give to Greta Ottlinger, and 2,000 guldens besides, if you will hand them over to me at this moment. If you refuse, I will lodge information against you at the police, and within half an hour you will be arrested, your house, books, and belongings searched, and even if nothing definite can be proved against you, you might be a cunning rascal, your business will practically be at an end. You will be marked as a suspicious person, and none of your customers will dare return to you for fear of buying stolen property." The Jew, who at the beginning of the interview had turned pale to the lips, had now regained some composure, rubbing his two hands together again.
"Now I see that your Excellency is a generous gentleman," he said benignly, "with no desire to harm a poor old man who has a wife and family to support, but with a wish to deal fairly with him. I swear to your Excellency that my greatest desire is to serve you in every way I can, and I will tell your Excellency the whole truth. I have never done such a thing before, but the woman tempted me, and the things were very beautiful. I did not like to keep them in my shop. It wasn't safe, and as soon as I received them from Greta Ottlinger, I packed them off, and sent them through a trustworthy messenger to my partner in London. I received a telegram from him this morning to say he had crossed the frontier quite safely last night, and is now out of reach of the police, who are still busy hunting for the things in this city. And if your Excellency will keep to your word, and give me 10,000 guldens, which will only be 1,000 over and above what the candlesticks have cost me, I will tell you where my partner is to be found, and then it will be your Excellency's own fault if you cannot succeed in inducing him to part with the articles in question."
"I will pay you nothing till I have the candlesticks in my possession. Then I pledge you my word that you shall be paid in full. Now choose quickly. You have no time to lose. The express starts from Vienna at 1 o'clock. If you give me your accomplice's address, together with a few lines on a card telling him that I am a friend, I will leave for London at that hour. If you refuse, I go this instant to the police, and lay information against you."
"How do I know that you will not lay information against me when once you have secured the goods?"
The Jew muttered suspiciously. "Look at me," said Valensky. "Do I look like a vile traitor who would use a man first and betray him after?" The Jew shot a piercing glance from his bleary eyes at the young Pole, whose manly face looked fierce, agitated, passionate, but certainly not false, and without another word he took from his pocket-book a business card, bearing the words "Moses Grunebaum, dealer in antiquities," wrote on the back "Isaac Davis, 14 Great Portland Street, London," and below "To introduce a friend," and handed it to Valensky. "I shall be back in Vienna on Saturday," said the latter, "and if I bring the candlesticks with me, I will bring you the money I promised on that very day." And, pulling his hat over his eyes, Valensky walked out of the shop, taking no further notice of the Jew, who followed him to the door, bowing obsequiously, and still irrelevantly calling to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to witness to his complete innocence. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On arriving at this hotel, Walensky found a telegram from Baron de Hermannsthal asking for his immediate presence at the detective's office. Wishing to avoid anything that might in any way seem suspicious, he went at once, although he had ceased to care now what the police were doing in the matter. Whatever they did could not affect the Candlesticks, as he would be in London long before the promptest investigations could possibly lead to the discovery of Grunebaum's agent abroad. Baron de Hermannsthal had, however, quite a great deal of news for him. The night before, the woman Greta Ottlinger had been arrested outside the Kaiser Franz for being drunk and disorderly, and had been induced this morning by the examining magistrate to reveal the name of Moses Grunebaum, a well-known dealer on the Kolvatring, as the receiver of all the stolen property she and her accomplices brought into the city. The man would probably be arrested that afternoon. "I thought you would be relieved to hear this," the amiable Baron added. "If you like a call at my office later in the day, I might give you a special permission to view the suspected articles in Grunebaum's shop, and if His Eminence's candlesticks are among them, and the police satisfied as to your claim to them, they might be handed over to you in the course of a few days." Oh, all this bureaucracy and red tapeism! How thankful Walensky was that he was independent of it. A few days, indeed, time to allow Madame Demidoff, who naturally would be communicated with at the same time as himself, to claim the candlesticks as part of her stolen property. In a few days Walensky hoped to be in Petersburg, back from London, the fatal papers handed over to Taranyev, and then his own connection severed from the Brotherhood. To that he was fully resolved. The last few days had taught him a lesson that would take a lifetime to forget. "I am exceedingly obliged to your Excellency," he remarked somewhat dryly, "for the trouble you have taken in this business. As I am obliged to quit town for a few days, I will leave the matter now entirely in your hands." "I don't think you can do better," said Baron de Hermannsthal. "It is now merely a question of time, for the property is in the charge of the police, no doubt, along with the other goods in Grunebaum's shop, and I will give strict orders that no candlestick is to be tampered with, till you or Madame Demidoff have identified those belonging to His Eminence." "I suppose," said Ivan tentatively, "that Madame Demidoff has been communicated with?" He was anxious to hear what her movements had been so far, how near she had been on his track. "I am expecting Madame Demidoff this morning, as I sent her an official communication, asking her to favour me with a call. She came back to Vienna yesterday, having exhausted all inquiries around AudioBo, and resolved to let us do what we could on her behalf." "No doubt, then, she will identify His Eminence's candlesticks," said Ivan, much relieved to find that Madame Demidoff could not possibly have seen Grunebaum privately in the short interval that elapsed between his own interview with the Jew and the subsequent police raid. He took his hat and bowed politely to the amiable Baron, as he once more thanked him for his kindness, then took a hasty leave, eager as he was to get away. The quest after the fateful papers had become an all-absorbing one. Ivan Walensky seemed unable to think of anything while he was on this mad chase after the compromising documents. He seemed almost to have forgotten the very existence of the prisoner in the Heumarkt, the comrades at Petersburg who had not yet heard the news, and those at home who would be wondering when and how he had started on his important mission, and how soon their manifesto would be placed in the Tsar's hands, and Dunajewski and the other brethren safely across the frontier, little knowing that the entire fabric on which the Socialist Brotherhood rested was in danger of crumbling at any moment. And delay was so dangerous. What had Count Lavrovsky done? Were the Russian detectives on the track of the conspiracy? Would they succeed in discovering the captive before any important good had resulted from the daring abduction? In any case, nothing but disaster to the cause and its followers could ensue while the papers that held all their secrets were in strange hands. To get those back was life and death to one and all, and with that all-absorbing fixed idea in his mind, Walensky, having packed up a few necessaries, was ready to start for London by the afternoon express. He had plenty of time during the 40 hours' journey to England to meditate on the folly of all this plotting and planning that inevitably led all those who indulged in it into perils of their lives and liberty. He himself, with ample means and a brilliant career before him, what a fool he had been to risk all his prospects for the sake of utopian ideas that would take perhaps centuries to develop, but surely would not be advanced by hot-headed coups such as Dunajewski, Taranyev, and he himself planned. Would a handful of young enthusiasts revolutionize Russia, when the moujiks for whose benefit they were supposed to plot and plan were the very last to lend them a helping hand? Aye, the reform of that great country would come some day, soon perhaps, as it came to France, violently, sweeping like a tornado a throne, a dynasty before it, But that would be when the people's hour had come, when the nation themselves knew what they were craving for, when liberty had ceased to be a word in the mouth of a few, and had become a desire in the hearts of all. Time then for all Russians that had pride in manhood to join in the cause of freedom and attack the throne if it stood in the way, sweep away the powers that be, if they do not tend to the desire of the people. But let it be the people that have that desire. Let it be the spark in their heart, placed there by a divine hand, and not kindled slowly and forcibly by the breath of a few fanatics. Amidst these conflicting thoughts, Walensky had reached the English capital. He left his bag at Charing Cross Terminus Hotel, meaning to start back for Vienna that same evening, and as soon as he had swallowed a light breakfast, he took a hansom and drove to No. 14 Great Portland Street. This time he was sure of his ground. There was no occasion to exercise any diplomatic skill. He walked straight into the shop, asked to see Mr. Davis, and said in a quiet, business-like tones, in fairly good English, "I noticed in your shop, a day or two ago, a pair of antique china and gold candlesticks that took my fancy at the moment. I hadn't the time to look at them then, but would be very glad if you will show them to me. They were of gold, with a very pretty Vienna cupids with bows and arrows. Do you recollect the ones I mean?"
"Oh, perfectly, sir, perfectly. I regret, however, that I cannot oblige you, as I sold those same candlesticks to one of my customers late yesterday afternoon. He is a great collector of curios of all kinds, and, like yourself, sir, was greatly taken with the beauty of the Vienna cupids. But I have some very beautiful candlesticks, both antique and modern, that you might care to look at."
"No," said Walensky, whose excited brain refused to take in the Jew's assertion. "I want those particular ones. I must have them, no matter what I pay for them. Here," he added, as he noticed that Davis was beginning to eye him suspiciously, "it is my introduction from your Viennese partner," and he handed him Grunebaum's card. "You will see by that I am a friend, and if you will deal fairly with me, no harm shall come to you. But if you refuse to help me to regain my property, for those candlesticks are mine, I will find means of setting the police on your track as a receiver of stolen goods. Now bring me those candlesticks at once, and name your price for them. I am in a hurry, as I want to catch a train." Isaac Davis took his accomplice's card, and turning it about between his fingers, still eyed Walensky with a remnant of suspicion. "I tell you, no harm shall come to you," said Ivan impatiently. "I am even willing to pay you a very handsome price for those candlesticks. You see, therefore, that you can but gain by being frank with me. Grunebaum gave me this card that you should have no fear."
"Sir, I have told you the truth," said Isaac Davis, at last dryly, added with an indifferent shrug. "As for your threats, they have no weight with me. I am free from blame. Grunebaum's is a good and well-known firm in Vienna. I have a perfect right to buy goods from him without falling under suspicion of receiving stolen property. I deny that the articles Grunebaum sends me are stolen, and I defy you to prove it. Whatever information, therefore, I choose to give you, I do so because my Viennese correspondent has recommended you to me, and not from any fear of your threats of the police." "Then," gasped Ivan, who was beginning to realize that the Jew was telling the truth, and the candlesticks were really out of his reach once more, "those candlesticks are sold?" "To a Mr. James Hudson of 108 Curzon Street, Mayfair, a great collector of antiquities and great connoisseur. You may probably have heard of him? No? Well, I sent him those candlesticks to look at yesterday, knowing well that if he saw them, he would take a fancy to them. They were very beautiful things, sir, and if you happen to have anything more of the same class of goods, I shall be very happy." "To the point, man, for God's sake. Tell me, did he buy them?" "He did, sir," said Isaac Davis, nettled at his curious customer's impatience. "I knew he would. What is the next thing I can do for you, sir? Nothing? Good morning, sir." And seeing another client enter his shop, Isaac Davis turned on his heel and took no further notice of poor Walensky, annihilated by this last most cruel blow of all. Ill luck was indeed pursuing him. Every now and then a ray of hope would pierce the darkness of his misery, only to be again dimmed by some terrible difficulty, each of which seemed more insurmountable than the last. The unfortunate young man was coming to the end of his endurance, and for one brief moment, as he reeled out of Davis's shop, the idea crossed his mind of ending all his misery once and for all by throwing himself underneath the first omnibus that passed. But it was only for a brief moment. The next he had realized that his death now, at this point, would mean hopeless, irretrievable ruin to his friends and comrades, all the more so as they would be unaware of their danger, completely ignorant as they were of the loss of the compromising papers. It was still on his coolness, his pluck and perseverance that hung the lives of his comrades, and he determined to make one more effort to save them. The last, he thought hopefully.
His plans would now have to be more complicated, and Valensky gathered all his faculties together for the laying of these plans. He had almost mechanically walked out of the Jew's shop, and still, unconsciously, was turning his footsteps towards Curzon Street. One thing was certain, he must see Mr. James Hudson. Any pretext would serve for that, he would think of one later on. What he must think out at once was, what he should say to Mr. James Hudson when he did see him. He knew him well by reputation. He was a man of boundless wealth and boundless eccentricities, generous to a fault, and had been a great favourite with the ladies in Prince Albert's days. No doubt he was a gentleman, and if... yes, that was it. The whole interview flashed before his fevered brain, as if he saw it on a stage. Characters. The courteous, benevolent old gentleman. A sort of modern Bayard, Mr. James Hudson. The young man with a past that involved a lady's honour, himself. Scene, a drawing-room in Curzon Street, Mayfair. The young man with a past. Sir, you hold in your hands the honour of a lady. Will you give me back the letter? Courteous old gentleman. The letter, sir? What letter? The YMWP. It lies concealed in yon candlestick that adorns your mantelpiece. Sir, years ago we were foolish. We sinned, she and I. Having no means of approaching each other, we used the graceful toy as love's letterbox. One of these letters, hers, was forgotten. There. She is now married. I am married. We are all married. But you, sir, hold the candlesticks. You hold her fate. Will you give me back the letter? Courteous old gentleman. Sir, pray take it. It is yours. Tableau. There is no doubt that at this stage poor Valensky's dreams had become the wanderings almost of a lunatic. His agitated manner, his wild, excited gestures attracted the attention of the passers-by. He made a violent effort at self-control, and having arrived at number 108 Curzon Street, rang the bell, and asked for the footman, who opened the door, whether Mr. James Hudson was at home. The elegant specimen, in knee-breeches, silk stockings, and powdered hair, looked down at him from the majestic height of 6 feet odd inches, and asked, in what seemed to Valensky very astonished tones, Mr. Hudson, sir? Yes. Will you please give him my card, and tell him I desire to speak with him at once? Sorry, I can't take the card, sir, said the footman gravely, and he added in solemn tones, Mr. James Hudson died, sir, this morning, suddenly, at 2:30, death being due to apoplexy, sir. He will be buried at Highgate Cemetery on Thursday, sir, at 11 o'clock. No flowers, by request. The housekeeper will see you, sir, if it is important. The voice sounded to Valensky as if it came from very far away, so far, in fact, that it had ceased to have an earthly sound. The man's face began to dance before his eyes, then to whirl past him at terrific velocity, as did the house, the furniture, the windows. He had only just sufficient strength to tell the man to call him a cab, to get into it, shouting to the driver to take him to Charing Cross Terminus Hotel. After that his senses mercifully left him for a time. The poor, tired brain refused to grasp this last calamity, the failure of his last hope. Valensky never remembers how he got to his room at the hotel, or what happened for the next few days, as complete nervous prostration followed the intense mental and physical tension. The people of the hotel sent for a doctor, who, under the circumstances, felt justified in opening Valensky's pocket-book, and seeing it well filled with banknotes and drafts, ordered a couple of hospital nurses, and everything else that was needful, which was chiefly absolute quiet and rest. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. While their comrade was undergoing the various vicissitudes into which his over-anxious zeal had led him, the members of the Socialist Brotherhood in Vienna had been going through a very bitter time of anxiety and dread for the future. A week had now elapsed since Ivan Valensky should have, according to his own statement, left Vienna for Petersburg with the papers entrusted to him, and up to this day no message had come from him. He had promised to give them some definite news of himself as soon as he had reached Petersburg. If all had been well, he should have been there 3 days ago, and must by now have given the papers over to Taranyev. Why, then, did he not wire or give some account of himself, to reassure them at least that he and the fateful papers were safe? The night before, they had met in their committee room in the Franzgasse, and it had been a gloomy and agitated meeting. The conviction had first begun to take root in their minds that the usual fate had overtaken their daring messenger, and that after this, any day, at any hour, The crushing blow might fall upon them all. Once their papers were in the hands of the third section, probably not one of them could hope to escape. And what was more galling, more bitter even, than the fear of death was the fact that their plot, so magnificently planned, so daringly carried out, would end but in their own perdition, with nothing gained save a gang of convicts tramping to Siberia. Unless... Yes, there was an unless. A grim and great alternative that, in spite of the President's almost entreating speeches, in spite of the better, more fined nature in most of them, had gradually but surely forced itself upon their minds. Merkovich had put it to them 5 days ago, when, flushed with their triumphs, they thought of nothing but the great ends that they could gain by their success. Now that this success seemed like bubbles, to be bursting before their eyes, they thought once more of their old comrade's grim words, and began longing for revenge. The President had asked them to meet again tonight, and towards 10 o'clock they dropped in one by one, anxious for news, full of eagerness. "Has anything been heard?" were the first words uttered by each as they entered, and, on hearing the gloomy negative, pipes were brought out and smoked in sullen silence. The President had arrived, urbane, temperate as usual, but even on his face there sat a look of deep apprehension, which he evidently strove to hide from his younger comrades. Every now and then he glanced anxiously towards the door, where Merkovich's footsteps would probably soon be heard. The latter had not yet arrived. Yesterday he had seemed more grim, more sullen than ever. Unlike the other members of the Brotherhood, his thoughts seemed in no way to dwell very anxiously on Ivan and his probable fate. They seemed to tend with ever-growing satisfaction towards the terrible goal, the attainment of which he hoped to reach shortly. He had not yet put into words those thoughts that he knew already loomed darkly in the minds of all, and which completely overmastered him. But he meant to obtain their consent tonight, and felt, as he entered the room and noted the attitudes of them all, that this would be an easy victory. He had taken good care to sow his seeds in good time. Tonight he meant to reap the harvest. Maria Stefanovna was with him. They all trusted her with the secrets of the fraternity now. The part she had so successfully, so discreetly played at the opera ball had shown them that a woman such as she was often a valuable adjunct in the affairs of men. The girl came in with her father, and having greeted those she knew best among the committee, she also lighted a short cigarette and waited to hear what they all had to say. "Merkovich, have you heard from Valensky?" asked a dozen eager voices.
"No," he replied. "I thought the President or some of the committee would have had some message from him by now."
There was silence, then a sullen voice said, "Svitlitsky declares that the papal nuncio did not go to Petersburg at all, but that he's been staying in the Tyrol for the last week." "But Ivan said that he was starting with him on the following day, Ash Wednesday."
"Surely—"
"No," interrupted the President.
"Do not fear that."
"Do you mean that he may have fallen into the clutches of the police?"
"That is impossible," said the President reassuringly, "for we should not all be sitting here peaceably. By now every one of us incriminated in those fateful papers, and most of us are, so, I imagine, would have been arrested. The very fact that we are still, all of us, free men, proves that our papers are safe."
"Our papers might be," rejoined one of the brethren, "but what about our messenger?" "He might, before being arrested, have succeeded in destroying the papers, you mean," said another.
"I feel sure," asserted one of the older men, "that Ivan would sooner part with his life than with our secret."
There was once more silence in the room. Merkovich's grim eyes travelled mockingly, perhaps even contemptuously, on those assembled round him. Maria Stefanovna took no part at all in the expression of these various surmises and conjectures. She sat listening attentively to all that was said around her, but her eyes, ever and anon, were attached with a curiously anxious and restless look on her father, who sat opposite to her.
"Does it not strike you, my friends," said Merkovich at last, sarcastically, "that it is impossible for us, some 800 leagues away, to arrive at any definite conclusion as to what has or has not happened to Bolensky?"
That was so. It seemed such a hard and dry fact, and yet there was some slight satisfaction, even in these vague conjectures, shared with one's neighbour, in hearing what the other comrades' thoughts and fears were, and every now and then in provoking a reassuring remark from their calm President.
"For my part," added Merkovich, "I think Bolensky's silence is exceedingly ominous. There could have been no possible danger in his sending a wire to the President, who is known to be a great friend of his, apprising him of his arrival in Petersburg." If he had accomplished the journey safely, you might be quite sure your chairman would have received such a message."
The President looked up anxiously at his comrade, and stretched out his hands towards him as if he would check him from proceeding with what he was going to say. "Speak, Merkovich, you have something on your mind," said one of the committee, and "Let us hear," came from all corners of the room. Maria Stepanovna, like the President, made a movement as if she would have wished to stop her father, but perhaps realizing the futility of such an attempt, she resumed her cigarette and her anxious, expectant attitude.
"What I have to say will, I know, not seem pleasant to some of you,"
said Merkovich, who had now risen and looked down on his assembled brethren from his towering height, with that contemptuous smile peculiar to himself.
"You see, most of you have had the misfortune of having been born gentlemen. I have not, and therefore none of those feelings you call refined have place in my burly, low-born mind. My friends, though you may be gentlemen, you must not be weak and effete like those of your class. For God's sake, look the facts straight in the face, and try to forget yourselves and your own petty feelings for the good of our country and our people which we serve. You would not listen to me before. Against my counsel you used our mighty, our successful plan for the paltry purpose of getting our comrades out of prison. I tell you," he asserted, bringing his powerful fist down on the table, "that they are all willing over there to die for the good cause. They are not, as we are, fond of life and liberty. They love the cause first, themselves not at all. Why should we care what has happened to Walensky? What is one man against the weal of millions?"
He looked inspired now, a prophet of the utopia that dwelt in all their hearts, the utopia at which some of them would have arrived by the most gentle of means, but which this man would conquer by fire and sword. They all knew what they would hear next. They knew what Merkovich had all through wished them to do. Most of them would willingly have stopped their ears not to hear the dreaded manifesto that this powerful man would in the next moment hurl at them.
"We have often had speeches here,"
resumed Merkovich once more,
"to inflame our enthusiasm against the tyrants that hold our destinies and those of our fellow men in the palm of their hands. I am no orator. The speeches did not come from me. Some of you, who might tonight seem weakest, spoke the loudest then, but I tell you, we have a great weapon in our hands against them. The one weapon that must sooner or later lay them prostrate at our feet, asking for the mercy they have never granted us. That weapon is fear. Let us strike terror in their hearts, my friends. They have no other vulnerable points. When we can, let us strike in the dark, at all times, swiftly and surely, so that in days to come, very soon, they will look at each other with blanched faces and trembling lips, and murmur what they dare not say out loud, 'My turn next, perhaps.' It is then, and then only, that we shall be the masters, when cowardly fear will place them grovelling at our feet. Then we can dictate, then we can negotiate, and before then what matter Dunajevsky or Walensky or 100 such? What are their lives that we should hesitate for a moment to wield the weapon that our own efforts have placed in our hands?"
He sat down once more, and a dead silence followed his speech. Enthusiasm was once more kindling in the gloomy faces around. Once more the man with the iron will had imposed it on his weaker comrades, and when his mocking eyes again travelled round the room he could read on the faces before him the results of his powerful words. He could read it in the gradual disappearance of the anxious looks, the unspoken terrors, could read it in the young, dreamy eyes now once more burning with the glow of enthusiasm, the thirst for valiant deeds, at peril of life and freedom. "Merkovich is right," was heard on all sides. Perhaps some of them still shuddered when they realized what his being right meant to the helpless prisoner in the Heumarkt, but they were very few now, and when the President's anxious eyes and Merkovich's triumphant ones scanned all the faces there, they knew that if the grim Socialist's wish was put to the vote, there would be many ayes and very few noes. "After all, my friends," resumed the stalwart Russian, now laying his trump card on the table, "I am sure, if you were asked, none of you would wish to see our great plot come ignominiously to grief through the liberation of our prisoner by the Russian police, and all of us convicted without having attained anything after having dared so much. Any hour, any minute now may see us all in the clutches of the third section, while Nicholas Alexandrovich leaves my house free and unscathed. Every second heightens our peril and diminishes the chance of our triumph.
At least if we fall, for there seems no likelihood of our being able to escape undetected, let us have accomplished something that will leave our names for ever glorified in the eyes of every patriot in Russia."
Thus was the doom of the prisoner sealed. Very little discussion followed. Unwillingly, but still unanimously, they had given their consent to the dastardly deed which Merkovich but too willingly offered to do for them. One or two of them asked for a respite, 24 hours, during which, after all, some news of Walensky might yet arrive. The old socialist, satisfied at having carried his point, willingly agreed to wait till the morrow, and a final meeting therefore was convened for the next day at the same hour. The President had said nothing. What was his influence against that of his grim comrade? The tide of feeling, a mixture of mistaken duty and misguided enthusiasm, had sealed the fate of the young Tsarevich. The weight of indecision seemed to have been lifted from the minds of them all. Although they neither smoked nor chatted, according to their wont, the gloom had quite given place to irrevocable determination. No more questions or surmises were put forward as to Walensky's probable fate, or their own certain doom. The word assassination had sounded once, pronounced by many lips with a shudder. It was now called execution. Merkovich, the willing executioner, they, the judges, who had arrested and condemned a prisoner, just as their tyrants did with the millions over which they held sway. Half an hour later they were all preparing to depart, sober and silent, with thoughts of the great morrow. No one had taken much notice of Maria Stepanovna, whose large dark eyes had been fixed on her father, as if he held her in a trance. When most of them had gone, she also slipped out of the room, not waiting to see if Merkovich was accompanying her, as she brushed past him. Out in the street, she hailed a fiacre, jumped in alone, and was driven rapidly in the direction of the Heumarkt. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Maria Stepanovna's position in the great Socialist Brotherhood was a curious one. The only woman among so many men, yet she knew all their secrets and plans, and, though young, had often been of good counsel to them. Merkovich, her father, had, early in life, accustomed his motherless daughter to his mysterious ways and curious weird speeches. Maria had been born and bred in the hatred of the rulers who sat upon the Russian throne, and listened to all her father's sometimes bloodthirsty schemes, not often sharing in them, but always with silent approval. When the Brotherhood, after full deliberation, decided to entrust her with the most important role in the abduction of the Tsarevich, she felt proud and happy at the thought of being for the first time of use to the great cause, which she had just as much at heart as the most enthusiastic among them. When Dunajevsky and his comrades had been arrested, the girl's ears were filled with horrible tales of the tortures they would undergo, both whilst in prison at Moscow, and afterwards during that weary tramp across the snowy desert, with horrible intervals of so-called rest in overcrowded, evil-smelling halting places. Then the mercury mines that in 3 years changed the hale and hearty youth into an old man, palsied and imbecile. And the cruel fate could be spared them if she, Maria, was clever enough to play the part that had been assigned to her, could lure the Tsarevich into a prison, not only comfortable but luxurious, where he would only be kept until those poor martyrs in Moscow were once more restored to liberty and happiness. She threw herself into the part of the enterprising odalisque, with the finesse and coquetry peculiar to all the daughters of the East, and the next day was able to receive with pride and delight the congratulations and thanks of the Brotherhood, assembled to do her honour. She guessed her father's dark thoughts with regard to the helpless prisoner under his charge, but so far had had no occasion to tremble for his safety. She knew most of her comrades as being of refined and temperate nature, knew the high-minded aristocratic president, the gentle and dreamy Poles who were in strong majority, and felt that her father's evil designs would be held well in check. But when Walensky, the trusted messenger, gave no sign of the success of his mission, when all spirits waxed gloomy and lips began to murmur, Maria's heart began to beat anxiously, both for the safety of the young captive and for the honour of the cause. The great cause she revered and worshipped, to which she meant to dedicate her life, was about to be polluted by a crime so foul, so cowardly, that Maria Stepanovna's whole soul rose in rebellion, and imperiously demanded of her woman's wit to find a means of averting so terrible a catastrophe, and it had been she who had led Nicholas Alexandrovich to what threatened to become an unknown grave. She looked shudderingly at her hands, and wondered if some of the young blood would not leave on them a lifelong stain. All night she paced up and down her room in restlessness and terror. At times she thought she could hear her father's footsteps creeping stealthily towards the prisoner's room, and then she had to stop her ears not to hear the last agonized cry of the young man, surprised and helpless in the hands of his assassin. It was broad daylight before her nerves and brain found a short respite from the terrible anxiety that had tortured her since that last decisive speech of her father's at the meeting last night. Womanlike, she had obstinately pondered till she thought she saw a way out of the difficulty. Being a Russian, she was very devout. She prayed long and earnestly for the success of her scheme, which was to save the prisoner from murder, and her comrades, her father, the great cause itself, from eternal shame. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It had been a weary and anxious time of waiting for Count Lavrovsky, while forced to sit patiently at the hotel watching for news of the truant, and sending reports on the Tsarevich's imaginary attack of measles to the authorities at home. But obviously the deception could not be carried on much longer. Already the Tsaritsa had spoken of coming herself to Vienna and nursing her son, and 1 or 2 imperious demands had been made through the ambassadors for bulletins signed by the great physicians, who no doubt had been called in to attend upon the illustrious patient. A day or 2 more would see the catastrophe all the more terrible, as Lavrovsky's deceit would be taken as a sure sign of complicity, and the old Russian now cursed his own weakness in not having immediately shifted the responsibility of this fearful calamity from his own shoulders, which would have been, as events proved, by far the wisest course to pursue. Disgrace would have been the result, then, perhaps an order to spend a couple of years abroad, but now he saw no hope before him, only a vision of Siberia, there to end the last years of his life. He had looked half shudderingly, half resolutely, at the tiny revolver that would be his supreme and forlorn hope. No doubt, in consideration of his long years of faithful service to the family, his imperial master would grant him the inestimable boon of death, instead of the slow tortures of a Siberian prison. Oh, how Count Lavrovsky wished he had never consulted that French detective, or, having done so, had confided the whole truth to him, for had he not led him into these additional days of deception, which he felt would prove his ruin? While Valensky, stricken down by his persistent ill luck, had at last found in physical prostration merciful oblivion from the harrowing anxieties of the past few days, Count Lavrovsky, in no less pitiable a plight than the young Pole himself, sat meditating as to whether he would once more seek out the old detective, this time armed with the determination to tell him all, or whether he would send a wire at once to Petersburg, asking for immediate help. The latter was undoubtedly the wiser course. Prudence and duty both dictated it, but human nature, ever prone to put off an evil moment to some more distant time, begged inwardly for more delay. It was therefore with a mixture of buoyant hope and surprise that Count Lavrovsky heard that a lady desired to speak with him on a matter of urgent business. She had refused to give her name, the waiter said, but had asked him to tell the Count that she was the bearer of a message from Monsieur Furet. "Show her up at once," said Lavrovsky eagerly. What could it be but good news? Something of importance the detective had heard and wished to communicate with him at once? Count Lavrovsky rose as Monsieur Furet's purported messenger entered the room and bowed instinctively as he beheld a lady of refined bearing, so different from the usual female detective's aide he had expected to see. Her face was closely veiled, but her figure and general appearance bespoke youth as well as refinement. She took the chair which the old Count was offering her, and dexterously placed it so that her back was against the window, while Lavrovsky's face remained in full light. "Monsieur le Comte," she began courteously, "I must first tender you my humble apologies for the slight deception I have been forced to practice upon you. I wish to make sure of being allowed to see you without delay, and use Monsieur Furet's name as an introduction to your presence. I am not his messenger." "But, mademoiselle," stammered Lavrovsky, bewildered at this strange preamble,
"You are at a loss to understand," rejoined the stranger, "how I knew that Monsieur Furet's name would be a passport to you. I will tell you that presently, when I have delivered you the message with which I am entrusted, and for which I will venture to ask your kind attention." Count Lavrovsky was too bewildered to reply. There was a slight pause whilst the mysterious stranger was evidently collecting her thoughts, and Lavrovsky instinctively felt some dread he could not account for, some undefinable fear that he would hear a message of life and death. "I think I am right in stating, monsieur," she resumed, "that you are at this moment in grave anxiety concerning the disappearance of an august personage whom I need not name. That is so, is it not?" Lavrovsky had half expected this, and yet he turned pale with emotion when he heard this stranger so calmly talking of this dreaded subject. He did not reply. The lady seemed not to expect it, for she proceeded at once. "Let me assure you, first of all, monsieur, that that august personage is well in health, and, for the present, in no personal danger." She emphasized the words "for the present," watching the effect on Lavrovsky's face. "True," she continued, "he is a prisoner at this moment, in a prison at once luxurious and comfortable, but he is in the power of persons, those whose emissary you see before you, who will be only too glad to give him back his freedom." A look of relief crossed the old Russian's face. He thought he understood it all now. In spite of her sex, her well-cut clothes, and refined appearance, this woman was one of a gang of desperadoes who lived by abducting persons instead of stealing goods, demanding high ransoms like wayside brigands. Well, thank God, there was no great harm done, and money in Russia is always plentiful when needed. Count Lavrovsky, without another word, took out his pocket-book, and laying it down on the table, said simply, "Name the price." "It is my object in coming here today to do so," said the stranger imperturbably, "but I will ask you, Count Lavrovsky, to put back that pocket-book. The price of the Tsarevich's liberty is not contained therein." Lavrovsky stared in mute surprise. Every minute of this strange interview plunged him into ever-growing mazes of astonishment. Then, rapidly and to the point, Maria Stefanovna plunged into her subject. She hardly paused to take breath. She had arranged the whole interview so thoroughly in her mind during those long, harrowing hours she had spent pacing up and down her room last night. She explained to the now almost bewildered old courtier the daring plot that had placed the heir to the Russian throne a helpless prisoner in the hands of a few young enthusiasts. She explained to him her own share in the matter, recalled to his mind the mysterious odalisque, and assured him that the august prisoner's comforts were attended to by herself with the utmost care. She spoke in clear, well-defined tones, with a briskness that fairly took Count Lavrovsky's breath away. The old Russian listened, horror-struck, to the open allusions or covert threats of His Imperial Highness's dangerous position. He heard with amazement how so monstrous a thing had been planned and executed on so sacred and august a personage by a gang of young men whose very existence he had been ignorant of, and he realized at once how futile would have been any effort on his part, or Monsieur Furet's, to fight so many enemies in the dark. "I think, monsieur, I have now made it clear to you that the Tsarevich's life is entirely in the hands of those who hold him prisoner, and my purpose in coming here today is to tell you on what conditions Nicholas Alexandrovich shall be restored to life and liberty."
"Conditions, madam? I will hear no conditions," exclaimed Count Lavrovsky, who at last recovered his speech at this outrageous audacity. "Death, swift and sudden, shall overtake you, one and all, and those who have sent you. Thank God the Russian police are far-seeing, far-reaching enough to reach the son of its beloved emperor without having to listen to conditions dictated by such as you." He had jumped up, full of wrath, and his hand was already on the bell-pull, in order to summon Stepan to guard this villainous emissary of evil tidings, while he himself sent forthwith to Petersburg for the wherewithal to punish this daring crew. Maria Stefanovna had sat there unmoved. Her foot tapping rapidly on the ground was the only sign of impatience she gave.
"Monsieur, remember," she said quietly, "that if you pull that bell, your young master will be dead before another night has passed over his head." The old Russian understood. What a fool he was. The woman spoke truly. What could he do but wait patiently, meekly, to hear the manifesto of these wretches who held the dagger against the Tsarevich's heart? Later, perhaps, revenge might come, but now they must negotiate, treat with them, however galling it might be.
"You are right, madame. No doubt you and your companions know how completely we are in your power, or they would never have dared to send you to me."
Then, with a violent effort at self-control, he added,
"I will listen to what you have to say."
Maria Stepanovna gave a sigh of satisfaction. She had gained his undivided attention, as well as his confession of the power she held in her hand. The plan she had formed in her mind needed now but propounding. She was sure at least of undivided hearing.
"Monsieur," she said, "although I own that the prisoner we hold in our power is one whose safety and liberty are of vast importance to, shall we say, one section of the Russian Empire, at the same time perhaps it has never struck you that he, in the person of his adherents and officials, holds captive many a one whose life and liberty are also of infinite value. Have you ever heard the name of Dunajevsky mentioned before now?"
The old courtier knew it well, the ardent, unforgiving nihilist whose capture, together with a score of his comrades a month ago, had been the triumph of the third section. He guessed now what this woman's object was in coming to him. An interchange of prisoners it was to be. Great heavens! What mattered if the world was populated with thousands of liberated convicts, as long as that one precious life was safe?
"I have here, monsieur," Maria Stepanovna was saying, "a letter which we propose you should lay before your master, the Tsar. In it we tell him that his son is in the hands of persons who hold him as hostage under certain conditions. The conditions are complete pardon for Dunajevsky and his comrades now in prison, together with a free pass out of the country. On the day that they have crossed the frontier, Nicholas Alexandrovitch will find his prison doors open and a fiacre ready to drive him to his hotel."
The old Count shuddered a little at the thought that he was to be the bearer of these fearful tidings, that he it was who would have to tell the anxious parents that their son was even now a captive, within range of an assassin's dagger. Visions of the terrible revenge the Caesars were wont to wreak on the messengers of evil news rose before his mind, and he thought of that momentous question the sorely tried mother and father would put to him: "What hast thou done with our son?"
"Is that all that is contained in the letter?"
he asked with an effort.
"Not quite all," she said. "In it we repeat to the Tsar which I here solemnly declare to you."
"And that is?"
"That we wish you to remember, monsieur, that you have no cause for the fear that Nicholas Alexandrovitch is in danger of his life. Give us back our comrades, and we will hand you over our hostage, as well in health as enforced captivity will allow. But also bear always in mind this one all-important fact, that the other side of the wall, where the Tsarevich lives, breathes, and sleeps, stands a guardian, grim, determined, ever wakeful. He needs naught but some confirmed fear, perhaps the sound of an alien footstep on the stairs, and the dagger, even held in his unerring hand, will be plunged straight away in the prisoner's heart."
The old courtier bowed his head, and sat for some time, mute, horror-stricken. It all seemed like the most terrible nightmare, this daring plot, these fanatics, and he, the unjust steward, who had betrayed his trust, and now was being, oh, so cruelly punished for the wrongs he had committed. Who knows? Had he been less cowardly, had he trusted to the great system of Russian police, they might have succeeded in dealing the return blow to these miscreants before they had had time to realize that they themselves were in danger. Alas, it was too late to mourn now. He, Lavrovsky, the Russian police, I, the Tsar and Tsaritsa themselves, were in these villains' hands, and nothing can be done to crush them, to torture them, to annihilate this young messenger, who came to him with a smile on her lips and the threat of death in her hands. He read the letter through that was to be laid before the Tsar. Then he looked up at the young figure before him, and vainly tried to read behind the closely drawn veil all that there was of enthusiasm, of eagerness, of mistaken sense for the rights of man.
"Madam," he said at last, "I have no doubt that when your friends sent you to me today, they knew that my consent to their demands was a foregone conclusion. The hostage you all hold is so precious a one that it is not for me to take vigorous measures unaided for coercing you into submission. If my young master's life is, as you say, in danger, and whilst he is in your hands I doubt not but that it is, no action of mine shall increase that danger. It is for His Imperial Majesty the Tsar to decide what shall be your fate, for believe me, a crime such as you have perpetrated will not remain unpunished long. Sooner or later it will bring its own doom, even though you may seemingly obtain your wishes now,
I will take your letter to my imperial master, and he shall decide what course he will wish to pursue." He had said this with much dignity. Maria Stepanovna rose. There was nothing more for her to do. Her self-imposed task was accomplished. Once alone, she would feel able to think of it as such, and try to realize whether she had gained a great victory, or delivered herself, her father, and her friends, bound hand and foot into the hands of the enemy. She rose, and Lavrovsky accompanied her to the door, courteous as ever, though in his heart he would have wished to crush this emissary of evil tidings. For some time he sat, his head buried in his hands. Then he rang the bell and ordered the Russian valet to pack his valise and bag, and be ready to leave the city by the evening express. The latter, schooled to unquestioning obedience, manifested no surprise, asked for no explanations, and was ready at the time appointed to take the journey to Petersburg with Count Lavrovsky. The old Count started with a heavy heart. The terrible adventure into which the Tsarevich's impetuosity had led them both was, as he feared, threatening to end tragically. Not for the heir to the throne, probably, though who could trust these murderous socialists, but to himself, the innocent one, who would be made the scapegoat, the whipping boy, on whom the imperial wrath would be free to vent itself. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Once out in the streets, Maria Stepanovna breathed freely again and lifted the heavy veil from her face. She was not afraid of being followed, for she knew well that in one thing at least she had completely succeeded, and that was in so absolutely terrifying that pusillanimous old courtier, that he would think of nothing save of the means of reaching Petersburg in as short a time as possible, and then shifting all responsibility as to the Tsarevich's safety onto other shoulders. Before she encountered the members of the Brotherhood again, however, Maria Stepanovna wished to be alone with her thoughts. Her resolution to dare this great coup had been taken so suddenly, her one great anxiety as to the best means of preventing the hideous contemplated murder had been so overwhelming that it never occurred to her to conjecture as to which view her father and the committee would take of her interference in their affairs. She had acted from motives of justice and honour, consulting only her woman's heart, and knew that certainly the President and most of the older and more temperate men would approve of what she had done. Probably, had they been given time and opportunity to think over the whole matter themselves, they would have desired some such plan as she had carried through herself, but Merkovich's powerful speeches, breathing of hatred for the tyrant, and all his kindred, impressive and enkindling as they were, carried all their more feeble wills before his strong personality, and they had never paused to think of the hideousness of their crime, but thirsted with Merkovich for vengeance when they began to realize that their messenger had somehow failed them. As to what had actually happened to Ivan Volensky, Maria Stepanovna could not conjecture. She dared not think that, perhaps, while she was striving for victory on her side, he should have fallen into the hands of the police, together with all the compromising papers he carried, and they all of them be irretrievably lost, while Dunajevsky and the other comrades were made free. Oh, if that terrible thing had happened! If she was destined to see her father and all her friends arrested and dragged to Petersburg for trial, that trial a mockery, then she would pray to God that the vengeance which had slipped from their grasp they would vent on her, and punish her for her daring interference before she was allowed to witness their sufferings. In the Franzgasse that night the meeting had been a gloomy, a melancholy one. 24 hours more had elapsed, and yet no sign or sound from Volensky. That some terrible mishap had befallen him, there was now no room for doubt, and the only hope that remained in the heart of some was the faint one that he had succeeded in destroying the compromising papers ere he allowed them to fall into the wrong hands. For this hope they considered they had a reasonable cause. The Tsarevich was still a prisoner in the house in the Heumarkt, and they themselves were still free and unmolested. As for Volensky, much loved and esteemed as he was by all, their thirst for vengeance rose high when they thought of his probable fate. Dunajevsky and his comrades were now hopelessly lost, and Ivan, no doubt, would be made to join them. Merkovich had said right. They none of them valued their lives and liberties. One and all of those martyrs out there in Moscow would willingly sacrifice both for the great cause that was to free Russia for ever from the tyranny that places her in the hindmost ranks of civilization. Well, at least they should not remain unavenged. The last lingering hesitation had vanished, the last feeling of honour and chivalry had died away. The refinement to which Merkovich had so sneeringly alluded was at last effectually smothered in the thirst for the annihilation of him who was one of the hated crew, of him whom at least they held in their power. No one noticed as she entered, some time after her father, that Maria Stepanovna was paler than usual, that her attentive, respectful attitude was changed to one of courage and determination. The usual purposeless, wearying questions were put with regard to the possible news from Walensky, the usual conjectures put forward as to his probable fate, and that of the compromising papers. Merkovich sat at the head of the table, drumming impatiently with his fingers, anxious evidently to hear the end of these barren conjectures and surmises. "Too late to think of all that now," he said at last, rising abruptly, unable to control his impatience. "Let us to God take it for granted that Dunajevsky, Walensky, and the others are lost to us for ever, that on all of us the blow might fall at any hour, any moment, and let us give ourselves over in the meanwhile to the joy that is divine, the joy of vengeance." "Merkovich, you are right," said a member of the committee. "I myself was one of those who wished to attain great ends by gentle means. I see now that we should all have been wiser to listen to your powerful counsels before. We should have saved our much-valued comrade, Walensky, from joining Dunajevsky in a fate that we could not avert. There is no news of him today, though 10 days have elapsed since he left us. He is either dead or a prisoner. I propose that sentence be passed on our captive, as, all but too soon, it will be passed on him." A curious joy illumined Merkovich's stern features. A look of triumph flashed across his sunken eyes. His hands clenched, as if he already held in their grip the son of the great tyrant who ruled and oppressed the people. His tall figure seemed to grow even more majestic as he stood there, the prophet of that vengeance which is the Lord's, the vengeance that would bring all the tyrants to their knees, grovelling in abject fear. The President took no part in the proceedings, his whole being revolted against the bloodthirsty scheme, but he was powerless to withhold the tide of feeling, and therefore remained in implied, if not actual, approval. Merkovich had said, "Let us vote," and most hands were raised to give consent to the terrible deed, but Maria Stepanovna had at last gained sufficient composure, sufficient strength of mind to oppose her woman's personality against this sea of masculine will-power. Hardly were the words, "You all consent, then," out of her father's mouth, and she stood up opposite to him, alone, defiant. "No, father, they do not consent." All heads were turned towards the young girl, whose voice they were so unaccustomed to hear in these assemblies, whose very presence they no doubt had forgotten, or they never would have discussed the dreaded topic before her. She had latterly been so much one of themselves that her very sex had been forgotten in good fellowship and camaraderie, and none had thought of forbidding her to come tonight, when a death sentence was to be passed, which her woman's ear had no right to hear.
"Maria,"
said Merkovich, somewhat gently,
"I am sure all our friends will agree in blaming me severely for allowing you to be here tonight. The harm done, however, cannot now be undone. We must all of us only entreat of your good sense, of your patriotism, not to try to oppose your weak will against what has been decided for the good of the cause, but to endeavour to gather strength, such as is necessary, if you wish to become a useful member of the fraternity. In the meanwhile you must let me take you home. This is indeed no place for one so young as you."
She had listened to him somewhat impatiently, though respectfully, since he was her father, but as soon as he paused, she resumed, "My friends, my comrades, my brothers, I have no right, I know, beyond that of friendship, to force you to listen to me, but I know so well what is passing in the minds of you all at this moment. You have none of you paused to think what a dastardly crime it is that you are all meditating."
"Maria!"
thundered Merkovich's imperious voice. "No, I will not stop, my father. Even if you all should decide that my audacity shall be punished with the same assassin's dagger you are even now sharpening for a helpless, defenceless youth." Merkovich had advanced towards his daughter. A dangerous look was in his eyes. 10 pairs of hands interposed to prevent father from striking that audacious daughter. No one else had spoken, and Maria had repeated, "No, that hideous, that low, dastardly crime will, thank God, never be accomplished."
"And who will prevent it, Maria Stepanovna?"
asked Merkovich, half wrathfully, half sneeringly. "I will," said Maria, and looked round quietly at the enthusiastic faces, all raised hopefully towards her. Then, while silence fell on all those assembled, while Merkovich himself listened awestruck at what her woman's wit had imagined and carried out, she told them in glowing words of what she had thought and done, since 24 hours ago she first began to realise that these utopian dreamers were descending the path that leads to dishonour, low, abject, and irretrievable. She told them of her horror when she thought that it had been she who had drawn an unsuspecting youth into a death-trap such as they were preparing for him, told them the misery the thought caused her, that it should be her own father's hand that was destined to strike the cowardly blow. Then she reminded them of the worthy object they had in view, when first they thought of abducting the young prince. She spoke to them of Donojevsky, of their comrades languishing so far in prison. "Remember," she said, that object was a noble one. Why should it ever have been abandoned? Our friend Walensky may have been arrested, stopped, it is true, but we have other means in our power still to save Donojevsky, and not to abandon Ivan to his fate." They did not understand what she was driving at, but still they listened to her glowing words, unwilling to interrupt her. Then she began to tell them of what she had actually accomplished, her interview with Lavrovsky, the old courtier's attitude, his confession of impotence, the letter which she had given to him to hand over to the Tsar, and which was but a replica of the one Walensky was taking across to Petersburg for them. It seemed incredible that a young girl who had seen so little of the world should have been able to so coolly mature a plan of such wondrous audacity, and having matured it, should have been capable of so successfully carrying it through. And it was wonderful to see the magical effect of the girl's words on all the gloomy spirits round. The feeling of manhood, of uprightness, temporarily smothered under the dark thoughts of vengeance, struggled for mastery once more. The young faces were once more aglow with enthusiasm that breathed of exalted patriotism and love for their fellow men. Merkovich only looked grim and sullen still, though every now and then a careful observer would have noticed in his eyes a look of pride for the daughter that had done this deed. When she had finished, a silence fell over them all, but this time it was a silence of happiness, of relief after the oppression of the past 24 hours. The President was the first to break in. He rose with much dignity and went up to Maria Stepanovna, who still stood, her cheeks aglow, her eyes aflame, watching the results of her words, trembling yet hopeful.
"Maria Stepanovna," he said simply, "I think I speak the words of all those assembled when I say thank you."
These few words seemed to relieve the tension. An enthusiastic vote of thanks was passed to Maria, who now, woman-like, feared she might break down through overmastering emotion. Harmony seemed restored once more. Merkovich only sat smoking grimly and silently. The others were chattering gaily, and Maria was assailed with questions. "When can we hear from Donojevsky as to whether they have crossed the frontier safely?" Maria Stepanovna had thought of everything. "It is to be officially announced in the Fremdenblatt," she said.
"And that very day, Merkovich, you will be relieved of your charge." "I think," he said obstinately, "that all tyrants and their brood are best out of the world altogether. And in the meanwhile," he added with his usual grimness, "we are to hope, I suppose, that Walensky and our papers are safe." But they refused to allow their enthusiasm to be damped. Hope reigned supreme in the committee room in the Franzgasse tonight. The papers could not be in the wrong hands, for the Tsarevich was still a prisoner in the Heumarkt, and they themselves were still free. And if their papers were safe, they had, they believed, every reason to hope that their messenger was likewise. The meeting was prolonged far into the night. Happy conjectures now took the place of gloomy ones, and Maria Stepanovna was the heroine of the hour. As soon as she felt quite convinced that her plan had been approved of, and that there was no more danger of her father reimposing his dark views upon them, she left them, followed by their cheers and blessings, to pray quietly in her own room that the rest of her plan might turn out as successfully as the beginning. Far away in a foreign, though hospitable land, in a hotel, and surrounded by strangers, this same comrade of theirs was hovering between life and death in the throes of an acute brain fever. The strain had been too great. The aching brain refused to bear any further burden. And the compromising papers, the fated candlesticks, where were they now? In whose hands would they fall? Would, after all this plucky fighting, the victory remain in other hands? And if so, would God grant that they were not in the hands of deadliest enemies? End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was about a week later that Nicholas Alexandrovich, wearied by long captivity, was surprised late one evening to find on his supper table
a neatly folded silk handkerchief, together with a letter addressed to himself. Any news to a prisoner is always good news. He tore the envelope open with eager alacrity, and read with amazement the following brief communication. If Nicholas Alexandrovitch will securely tie round his face the accompanying handkerchief, and allow, without resistance, some persons to lead him out of his present abode into a fiacre, he will find himself restored to complete liberty. The persons entrusted to accompany Nicholas Alexandrovitch will wait upon him 1 hour after midnight. It would have been more than folly to allow foolish pride to stand in the way of possible escape. The thought that this might be some dangerous trap flashed through his mind, only to be instantly dismissed. Had his jailers wished to do him further bodily harm, or to remove him to some other place of safety, they had every power to do so without the preliminary farce of apprising him of their intentions, or of requesting him to blindfold his own eyes. 1 hour after midnight he was ready, the handkerchief tied round his face. He heard the door open and the sound of several footsteps, then he felt his hands taken hold of by some powerful grip, and was led through the room and down the stone stairs he had climbed a fortnight ago with such buoyancy of spirit. Evidently he was under heavy escort, for it seemed to him that someone was walking in front of him and someone behind, whilst on each side a third and fourth guardian held each of his wrists in a relentless grip. He was helped into a fiacre, still blindfold and his wrists still tightly held, and after about a quarter of an hour's drive the vehicle stopped, the doors were opened, and Nicholas Alexandrovitch was helped to alight. It seemed to him that the hold on his wrists slackened, then was released altogether. The next moment he heard the doors of the fiacre slam to, and the vehicle start off at a breathless gallop. He realized that he was free and alone, and rapidly tore the handkerchief away from his face. He looked around him bewildered. The street in which he was long and deserted. A row of houses, all built on the same pattern, not very brilliantly lighted, not a soul in sight, but in the far distance the now fast disappearing fiacre a mere speck, which also was soon lost to view. As if in a dream, and not knowing where he was, the Tsarevich walked on for a little while at random, hoping to emerge soon on some more busy thoroughfare. Presently he met 1 or 2 passers-by, from whom he asked directions as to the best means of finding a vehicle at this hour of the morning, he being a stranger in the city and having lost his way. The information was given him, and 5 minutes later Nicholas Alexandrovitch found himself once more in a fiacre, this time being driven rapidly in the direction of the Hotel Imperial. In the vestibule his faithful Russian valet awaited him, whose joy at seeing his young master safe and well seemed unbounded. Behind him stood 2 or 3 official-looking personages, who saluted respectfully as the Tsarevich alighted. Lavrovsky was not there, but an elderly man with a decoration in his buttonhole advanced, as Nicholas beckoned him to follow him to his rooms. "No doubt, monsieur," said the Tsarevich, "you are here for the purpose of giving me an explanation how some miscreants succeeded in keeping the heir to the Russian throne under lock and key for 14 days before your minions managed to discover my whereabouts and force them to let me go free."
"Your Imperial Highness," replied the old official, "is justly wrathful at what must seem to you our unpardonable negligence, but—"
"You must have known I had mysteriously disappeared the night of the opera ball."
"Count Lavrovsky only thought fit to inform His Majesty that your Imperial Highness was confined to your room with a slight indisposition."
"And?"
"And it was not till 4 days ago that he arrived at Petersburg bearing the terrible news."
"You were told, of course, at once to set all your staff at work?"
"I was given no orders, your Imperial Highness, and no one, not even I, knows what passed between His Majesty and Count Lavrovsky, nor was I officially informed of your Imperial Highness's terrible predicament. The day before yesterday I was ordered to take 2 of my chief officers with me, and with Stepan, your Imperial Highness's valet, to proceed at once to Vienna and stay at this hotel under some assumed names, always ready to receive your Imperial Highness whenever you arrived."
"This all seems very mysterious. I cannot understand it. Are you, then, not to attempt to trace the daring abductors of my person?"
"We are only, it seems, to thank heaven that your Imperial Highness has been once more providentially restored to us. That is all the information I have, officially."
"And privately?"
"Oh, mere conjectures."
"I must hear them."
"I will give them to your Imperial Highness for what they are worth, but it is not often that my long experience as Chief of His Majesty's Police leads my instinct on the wrong track. Before I started for Vienna, I had in my hand His Majesty's letter, granting a free pardon to the gang of nihilists headed by one named Dunajevsky, who were waiting condemnation for their last attempt against the very life of our august monarch. The letter was accompanied with a free pass for all of them across the frontier, signed by His Majesty's own hand, and to which I was ordered to affix the official seal.
And these Nihilists
were set free that very evening, and under safe escort crossed the frontier in the early hours of last night, when they were handed their passports and left to go whither they chose.
Even now I do not quite understand.
An official telegram was sent from Russia announcing this unparalleled liberation of Nihilist convicts to every Viennese paper, who have published the news this morning. And the Russian chief of police took from his pocket a copy of the Fremdenblatt and one or two other papers and handed them over to the Tsarevich.
Then you think I was taken as a hostage? The Russian nodded.
This is mere supposition on my part, he said.
The right one, I feel sure, and my liberty was to be the price of that of these ruffians.
That is why, no doubt, Your Imperial Highness, the eyes and hands of the Russian police remain tied. Then he added between his teeth, for the present.
And Lavrovsky? The old Russian shrugged his shoulders. I will not have a hair of old Lavrovsky's head touched, said the Tsarevich impetuously. He did enough to prevent my running after this mad adventure. He could do no more.
He should have communicated with us at once, said the chief of police resentfully. We might have caught the villains.
And probably found me a dead man. No, my good Kropotkin. He acted for the best. He believed I had gone on a young man's escapade, and wished to save my reputation. Lavrovsky is not to blame.
No doubt Your Imperial Highness has every influence to avert the disgrace from Count Lavrovsky's head. In the meanwhile, I and my men are ready to escort Your Imperial Highness back to Petersburg.
Like a schoolboy who has been playing truant. Well, I shall be glad to leave this city with its unpleasant associations. We will start homewards tonight. And Nicholas Alexandrovich, tired and enervated, dismissed the chief of police with a smile and a bow. It had been a curious adventure, and he wondered if he would ever hear the true version of it, or if those who had so daringly planned it would ever come under the far-reaching clutches of the police. That this was extremely unlikely, both he himself and the astute Kropotkin were fully aware when, during the rapid journey back to Petersburg, they discussed the possibility of bringing the miscreants to justice. The Tsarevich himself had never as much as set eyes yet on any of his abductors. The only one he had ever seen throughout his captivity had been Maria Stepanovna, of whose face he caught but a mere glimpse in the fiacre that eventful night, when she was disguised as the odalisque, and the 2 or 3 moujiks, purported to be deaf-mute, who had been his servants and guardians in his imprisonment. That, through a description of them made by the Tsarevich, some faint clue might be obtained was just possible, but Kropotkin well knew that the chances of tracing a man by mere verbal description are excessively remote. As for the house, or even the locality where so exalted a prisoner had lived and breathed for over 2 weeks, there was no hope of ever arriving at a conclusion as to its whereabouts. The Tsarevich was a complete stranger in the city, and could not even have told in which direction it lay. The outside of the house he had never seen, nor anything in it, save the 2 rooms he had inhabited. The chief of police bit his moustache in impotent fury when he realized how magnificently the whole plot had been carried through, and how, in all probability, the daring conspirators would also escape after the great victory they had gained in the liberation of Dunajevsky and his brother Nihilists. The same night on which their prisoner was once more restored to liberty, at about the same hour, the members of the Brotherhood sat once more in the committee, smoking and chatting gaily. The President, who seemed quite restored to his former urbane self, was talking of Maria Stepanovna, whom he regarded as the saviour of them all. All the older men looked up to her as one who had prevented lifelong remorse from haunting the rest of their lives, and the younger ones as the prophetess of their utopia, who would lead them to victory through her wise counsels and daring deeds. There was eager expectancy on all the faces round, and many were the glances that stole towards the clock that seemed to be ticking in a provokingly slow way. Ah, at last! There was the sound of footsteps outside, and soon the door was opened, and 4 of the comrades, including Merkovich, came in. They were greeted with a unanimous cry of inquiry. "Well?" "Well," said Merkovich, "the last chapter of our sensational novel is closed. Dunajevsky and our comrades are by now on their way to England, and Nicholas Alexandrovich is discussing with Kropotkin the possibility of bringing us all into the clutches of the 3rd section."
Derisive laughter, full of gaiety, triumph and enthusiasm, greeted this suggestion. "That is an impossibility," they all asserted. "They have not the faintest clue." They refused to listen to Merkovich's threatening speeches, his regrets at the happy escape of one of the tyrant's brood. They were discussing Donidzewski's surprise when he found himself a free man, with a passport, allowing him and his comrades to go whither they chose. One or two of the older members had gone to meet them at Hamburg with money and clothes to enable them to embark for England. Maria Stefanovna had gone with them. It had been thought wiser that she should be out of the country for a little while, both for her own safety and for that of all her comrades. Let them, out there at Petersburg, do their worst to discover the originators of this great plot so complete in its victory. What could they do when there was no clue?
"None," said Merkovich quietly, "except our papers, which we have entrusted to Walensky, and of which, and of our messenger, we have not the slightest news."
If his wish was to dampen enthusiasm which he had not kindled, he certainly fully succeeded. It certainly did seem strange that no news of any sort or kind had been heard of the young Pole since the night when he had announced his departure, under the protection of His Eminence the Cardinal, for the following morning, and nearly a fortnight had elapsed since then. Though every confidence was still felt in the messenger, there was a curious restlessness, a vague, undefined fear appreciable when his name was mentioned. The President's uneasiness at the topic was also decidedly ominous. But he, evidently, though unable to account for Walensky's protracted silence, would not allow the slightest doubt to be cast on his absent young friend's good name. The ugly word traitor had been whispered once or twice, but not in his hearing. The older men believed in some untoward accident to the messenger, but still hoped that the papers were safe. It would be such a crushing blow after the great victory, to have to face defeat so complete, so humiliating, with no hope of vengeance, now that their hostage was out of their hands. Those papers were so hopelessly compromising, both to them and to those at Petersburg to whom they were addressed, that not one of them could possibly hope to escape. The President, as usual, tried to reassure them, and to calm the tide of feelings that began to rise high against Walensky.
"Remember," he said, "we must not condemn him unheard. After all, our papers cannot at this moment be in wrong hands, or we should not be sitting here unmolested, and what occurred an hour ago would not have taken place."
That was obviously the case, and all felt perhaps a trifle reassured. Anyhow, it was but a waste of time to sit and discuss Walensky's possible movements at this moment. News, good and bad, was bound to reach them sooner or later that would clear up this mystery. Some future meeting in a day or two was arranged, and all prepared to leave. As Merkovich was about to turn to the door, something in the eyes of the old President made him pause and wait, till they too were left, the sole occupants of the room.
"You know something, Lobkowitz. What is it?" "Look at this letter I received this morning." "From Walensky."
"Read it." Merkovich began reading half aloud.
"Charing Cross Hotel, London. My dear Lobkowitz, you will wonder at the place I am writing from, and still more so at what I can possibly be doing there. I have been at death's door, my good friend, owing to a series of the most terrible misfortunes that could befall any man. Do not be alarmed, though the news I am at last able to send you is of a most terrible kind. The papers are out of my possession." Here a half-suppressed oath escaped Merkovich's lips, and his hands clenched themselves over the almost illegible letter, obviously written by a sick man, hardly able to hold the pen. "For God's sake, read on," said the President. "There is not a moment to be lost." "The most fatal conglomeration of mishaps," continued Merkovich, "originally deprived me of them, at the very moment when I had placed them in what I considered absolute safety. Since that terrible hour all my energies have been spent in recovering them, for although I have always known where they were, they always have, by some almost diabolical coincidence, evaded my grasp at the very moment when my hand was, so to speak, upon them. At last the strain on my brain shattered my health, and I have been thrown on a bed of sickness. Again I say, do not be alarmed. To the best of my belief, no mortal eye has as yet rested upon our papers, and our secrets are still our own. But I am now too feeble to act alone. I must have help from one of you, and I may want a great deal of money. I dare not ask what happened in Vienna. If our comrades are free, if, not hearing from me, you have dared to act, or if Nicholas Alexandrovich still remains a hostage. For God's sake, I beg of you, my friend, do not mistrust me, and if possible, not to alarm our comrades unnecessarily. All is not lost yet, but I must have your help. Come as soon as you can, your friend and comrade,
Ivan Stefanovich Valensky. Merkovich did not speak, made no comment. He crushed the letter in his hand, and there was a dark scowl on his face. The President waited for a while. He knew the fanatic Russian's violent temper. He began to fear for his young sick friend, who already seemed to have suffered so much. "I cannot go, unfortunately," he said at last, "and there is no one I could trust more completely than you, Merkovich." "Oh, I will go all right enough," said Merkovich, "and take the money, since money is wanted. But," he added fiercely, "let Ivan look to himself if our papers fall into the wrong hands." "It was a blunder at worst, I feel sure," said Lobkowitz. "Ivan is no traitor. I pledge you my life as to that." "I'm not accusing him," rejoined the other impatiently. "But the trusted messenger of our brotherhood had no right to blunder." "Well, we know very little so far. Do not let us imagine the worst. He writes hopefully after all." "I had better start tonight," said Merkovich. "Can you let me have for the funds? He says much may be wanted. For bribery, I suppose." "Come and see me at my house before you start. I will have everything ready for you, and, Merkovich," he added, "do not condemn unheard. Remember, Ivan is young, and has our cause just as much at heart as you have." "Well, if he has, he certainly has it in a different way," said Merkovich, as he shook the President's hand and prepared to leave. The latter sighed, as he tried to read the Russian's thoughts through his deeply sunken eyes, tried to fathom if there lurked some danger there for his young friend. Then, half reassured, he gave Merkovich a parting handshake, and watched the old fanatic's figures slowly disappearing down the stairs. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. By order of the executors of the late Mr. James Hudson, Messrs. Phillips and Phillips will sell on the premises the whole of the contents of the superb mansion known as 108 Curzon Street, Mayfair, consisting of antique and modern furniture, piano, china, glass, pictures, and a rare and valuable collection of antiques, gold and silver plate, jewels, etc. The sale will take place on Thursday next, the 12th inst., at 11 o'clock precisely. To view, by cards only, the day prior to and morning of the sale. Cards from Messrs. Gideon, Eyre and Blackwell, solicitors, 97 Bedford Road, W.C., all from the auctioneers. It was some 10 days since Valensky, stricken down by illness, had had enforced rest and captivity in a London hotel, and now he sat convalescent, yet still ailing, bodily and mentally, with that day's Times, containing the above announcement, in his hand. He had now become almost accustomed to his ill luck, which had been pursuing him so steadily without break or respite, landing him at last on a bed of sickness in a hotel, in a strange land, far from all his friends. The long enforced rest the doctor had prescribed for him had enabled him to collect his energies for a final struggle, which he knew was inevitable. Matters, he knew, could not remain as they were. The sacred trust that had been placed in his charge, and which he had so unwittingly betrayed into alien hands, must become his again, if at the cost of the last remnant of energy left in him, after so protracted a struggle. Vainly, during the long hours of enforced idleness, he had tried to conjecture where the scene of his next battle would be laid, the decisive battle he would yet have to fight. And there it was, announced in the columns of the Times. The scene would be an auction room, the battle one of money. He had written to Lobkowitz, asking for his help, and now was waiting anxiously to know what the President had decided to do. He believed that Lobkowitz would continue to trust him to the last, and hoped he would not find it necessary to ask the help and counsel of some more determined members of the committee. Valensky felt that they would never forgive, and look upon his blunder as a twin brother to a crime. In the midst of his reflections, the waiter interrupted him, telling him that a gentleman, a foreigner, desired to speak with him. "Show him up at once," said Valensky eagerly. He hoped it would be Lobkowitz, longed to grasp his old friend's hand, tell him all he had suffered and revel in his sympathy. But it was Merkovich, sullen, grim, half menacing, who refused to take his hand, and would not sit, but stood firm and silent till Ivan had explained and told him all. And it was to this stern judge, this man whose unerring hand would inevitably punish the guilty, if guilt there be, that Ivan Valensky had to tell the history of his relentless fate. He told him of the Cardinal's mission of the Emperor's Candlesticks, with the mysterious hidden receptacles into which, believing he was acting for the best, he had hidden the compromising papers. Then of the Cardinal's sudden caprice in entrusting these candlesticks into the hand of a friend, a lady. He told him of the robbery at Oderberg, the escape of the thief, his own cautious interview with the chief of police. He described his fruitless search in Greta Ottlinger's room, his loathsome experience with the coarse woman in the Kaiser Franz, his interview with Grunebaum, his journey to London, then his visit to Davis, all fruitless, all leading to more disappointments, more hopeless entanglements. Then, finally, and worst of all, the crushing of all his hopes at the door of Mr. James Hudson, who, by some fatality in which the superstitious Pole saw the hand of diabolical agency, had died suddenly that very night. Merkovich had listened attentively and silently through this long narrative of misery and struggle. A kinder look had perhaps replaced the habitual grimness on his face, and when Ivan paused, at last exhausted, he drew a chair near the sick man's couch, and said almost gently, "My poor friend, you must have suffered much." Ivan thanked him with a look, and eagerly grasped the hand the old socialist now held out towards him. "I suppose you are quite aware where you committed the great, the only real fault in all this long history of misfortune," said Merkovich at last, still quite kindly. "You mean that I did not communicate with either Lobkowitz or yourself the moment those candlesticks passed out of my possession?" Merkovich assented. "Remember, I gathered from the Cardinal's speech that the lady had never touched the one which contained our papers. It was damaged, and in his Eminence's own presence she had packed it up and placed it on one side." "I noticed, Ivan, that you have not told me the name of the lady who had charge of the Emperor's candlesticks, and therefore, like yourself, has some right to claim them." Volensky paused a while, and then the name came from his lips like a whisper. It was Anna Demidoff. Merkovich jumped up. The gentleness, the sympathy he had assumed for a brief space was gone in a moment, and once more there stood the judge, ready to punish and to condemn. "Ivan Stefanovich Volensky," he said, "you were then content to allow that spy, that agent of our bitterest foes, to have even for an hour our dearest secrets under her roof, close to her very hand, without sweeping her out of our path, or, if you were too faint-hearted, asking those who are strong to clear the way of such a powerful foe." Ivan did not reply. What could he say? The reproach was true enough, but he had meant well. It was fate that had been too strong. He watched Merkovich now, as the grim nihilist paced up and down the narrow room, with thoughts of vengeance written on his stern, rugged face. "If only the Tsarevich were under my hand still," he muttered, "all might yet have been saved." "Then," asked Ivan eagerly, "Donojevsky?" "He is in England safely today, and the Tsarevich back in Petersburg." "I do not understand," said Ivan, bewildered. "How, then, were the negotiations conducted?" "In the simplest way imaginable," said Merkovich, "by a woman, my daughter." "Maria Stefanovna?" "She, it appears, had some womanish scruples, shared, by the way, by many of our comrades, as to the advisability of doing away with our prisoner, as I had proposed all along, and accomplishing by terror what we could not do by diplomacy. When you were not heard of, and it became clear that some untoward fate had reached you, we all voted Nicholas's death sentence. She, on her own initiative, thought out the daring plan of making that old fool Lavrovsky be the bearer of our manifesto to the Tsar, in exactly the same terms as on the letter you were yourself taking to Taranyev. Without consulting the committee she sought him out, for we had previously ascertained that through sheer terror he had persistently put off communicating with the government in Petersburg. With the dagger, so to speak, at his master's heart, Lavrovsky had no chance but to accept, and he became the bearer of our ultimatum. What passed at Petersburg between himself and the authorities we, of course, do not know, but 3 days ago the official papers announced the liberation of the convicted nihilist Donojevsky and his comrades, and their safe conduct across the frontier. Some of our committee met them there with money and clothes, and Maria went with them, as we all thought it would be safer for us all if she stayed in England for a while. The evening of the same day the Tsarevich was led blindfold out of my house in the Heumarkt, and thus was terminated the finest plot ever invented by our great brotherhood. "Thank God for that," said Ivan fervently.
"Curse you for compromising us all and our cause just after our glorious victory," retorted Merkovich savagely, "and curse our folly for trusting you so much." The young Pole sprang up at the taunt.
"Your trust is not misplaced, Merkovich," said quietly, "and our cause and our comrades are not compromised. Give me the necessary funds and the right to dispose of them, and I swear to you that 3 days hence I will hand over our papers safely in your keeping, to act with as you please after that, both with them and with me." "You know then where the candlesticks are at this moment?" said Merkovich, somewhat pacified. "They are to be sold by auction on Thursday next, and we can buy them easily enough." "Yes, unless fate or Madame Demidoff interposes." "Madame Demidoff cannot know where the candlesticks are. Grunebaum was arrested half an hour after I saw him. He is not likely to have betrayed his accomplice in London, and she was bound to lose trace of them." "You must act as you think best, Ivan," said Merkovich at last. "As you know, we have ample funds, those of the fraternity, and Lobkowitz has placed them all at your disposal. We must trust you yet so far." And he added, after a slight pause, "After that, your life is in our hands." That Ivan knew full well. He knew that if harm came to the Brotherhood after this, he would not be allowed to suffer or die with them. He knew that they would brand him as a traitor, disown him, revile him, and that he would die alone in the dark, stricken by the dagger of an avenger, and not be thought worthy of the common death of the martyrs. Merkovich handed him over the drafts and money Lobkowitz had given him. It represented a large sum, and Ivan took it, feeling easy in his mind. The old Russian left him soon after, and Valensky was left alone and in peace to form what plans were needful. The interview with Merkovich had been very stormy, and it needed a strong effort of will to collect his faculties in the last great endeavour to save his comrades and himself from the dire catastrophe. Obviously, the first thing to do was to obtain a card to view the contents of 108 Curzon Street, and ascertain whether the Emperor's candlesticks were included among the objects put up for sale. Having assured himself of that all-important fact, his last move was to go to the auction room on Thursday, and with the help of the funds placed at his disposal, bid for the candlesticks till they became his property. The first part of his programme he found very easy of execution. The next morning he obtained a card from Messrs. Gideon, Eyre, and Blackwell, and ascertained that the, to him, ill-fated candlesticks were to be among the objects put up for sale on the following day. So far, so good. There were a great many people examining the furniture and artistic bibelots, of which there were many thousands, but those people were chiefly Jews, dealers probably, and Valensky knew that the sum of money the secret society had placed at his disposal was infinitely beyond what the richest dealer could afford for a single bibelot. His mind therefore was perfectly at ease as to the result of next day's sale. When he left the house he stopped on the doorstep one moment to light a cigar. At that moment a carriage stopped too. A lady got out, with an admission card in her hand, and without noticing him, brushed past him and walked into the house. It was Madame Demidoff. As a matter of fact, it had never for one moment entered Valensky's mind that either Madame Demidoff or the Cardinal could by any possibility hear of the whereabouts of the missing candlesticks, and the lady's presence there fell upon him like a thunderbolt. And yet, what more natural than that she should be here? 2 weeks had elapsed since the robbery. Grunebaum had in the meanwhile, as Valensky knew well, been denounced by his accomplice. His premises and books must have been searched, the name of his London accomplice discovered, and Madame Demidoff had no doubt acted in precisely the same manner as he, Valensky, had done himself, and, either through threats or bribery, traced the stolen candlesticks from Davis's shop to the house of Mr. James Hudson. That her presence there meant the gravest danger to him, Valensky was at once aware. It was absolutely evident now that she had a secret personal interest in the recovery of the candlesticks, or she would never have come to London herself, but sent a clever agent to secure her stolen property. If she intended to bid for them the next day, Valensky felt it would mean the ruin of his hopes. He could now command a very large sum of money in an emergency like the present one, but if report spoke truly and Madame Demidoff was a paid agent of the Russian government, then her credit would be practically unlimited, and the duel between him and her won for life and death. Oh, for the power to look 24 hours ahead, to know the worst at once! One moment he thought of inquiring at every hotel in London for Madame Demidoff and hearing his fate from her own lips, but apart from the hopelessness of such a task in a city of such magnitude as London, he felt that the lady might look upon this move as a sign of weakness, and after all, so full of hope is the human heart, there was just a faint possibility yet that Madame Demidoff had not discovered the secret papers. In that case, the moment she recognized Valensky among the bidders, she would retire from the contest in the belief that he was acting for Cardinal d'Orsay. No, all was not yet lost, and Valensky heaved a deep sigh of relief as he thought that tomorrow would, in any case, whether for good or bad, end this terrible suspense, which, except for a few days of blissful unconsciousness, he had had to endure for 2 mortal weeks. But what of Madame Demidoff? She, like Valensky, had been enduring tortures of uncertainty, fears, doubts, hopes, alternately for the last 3 weeks. Directly after Grunebaum's arrest, she had been communicated with by the police, but to her horror failed to discover the candlesticks among the articles seized in the Jew's shop. With great difficulty, and only with the help of a large amount of Russian money, she obtained a private interview with the prisoner, who, deeply revengeful at what he thought was Valensky's treachery, most willingly gave her every clue as to the whereabouts of the missing candlesticks. A great deal more Russian money was needed to induce Isaac Davis to speak about them again. He felt suspicious, and did not like the mystery that seemed to gather round them. He flatly denied for a long time any knowledge of them, and it was only hard bribery that induced him to name the client to whom he had sold the candlesticks. Like Valensky, Madame Demidoff went to the house of Mr. James Hudson, relying on her own often tried powers of fascination to induce him to give up what she meant to describe as a compromising letter, and, like Valensky, she felt unutterably hopeless on hearing that Mr. Hudson was dead. A week after that, Madame Demidoff had seen the announcement in the Times, and, quite unsuspecting that Valensky was on the same track as herself, felt quite relieved to see that the candlesticks were among the objects put up for sale at 108 Curzon Street. As far as she was concerned, it would be a wonderfully easy matter to bid for them, and purchase them at any price. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A great crowd had already assembled in the dining room where the auction was to be held when Valensky arrived upon the scene. A number of dealers, mostly Jews, who all seemed to know each other, were quietly arranging among themselves as to which particular lot they each intended to purchase. The sale began punctually at 11 o'clock. Valensky looked around anxiously. The crowd in the room was very dense. He could not see Madame Demidoff. The larger pieces of furniture were first put up and rapidly knocked down at varying prices to different dealers, who mostly got their purchases very cheaply. The only times that the prices ran at all high were when some unfortunate outsider or private bidder attempted to compete against the clique of dealers, who stood closely packed near the desk of the auctioneer, and hurriedly ran the prices up till the poor misguided private bidder retired discomfited. It was very late in the day when the curios and valuable knick-knacks were at last in their turn put up for sale. Jewellery, gold and silver plate, Egyptian and other antiquities, and at last, "A pair of unique gold-mounted china candlesticks," shouted the auctioneer. "What shall we say? £50 the pair?" "Guineas," said a voice. 60, said another. 70, 80, 5, came in rapid, successive bids from the various dealers. In this preliminary skirmish Valensky had not joined. He waited till most bidders had fallen back, knowing full well that it had been arranged previously who should have the last bid for the candlesticks. But when another voice had said 90, there was a pause, and the auctioneer began his customary, "Now then, gentlemen, a pair of unique—" 100, said Valensky, in a voice he hardly recognised as his own, so excited was it. "And 50, came from a nasal tone in the front ranks. 200, said Valensky. "And 50, said the nasal tones. 300, said Valensky, who, having recognised his antagonist as one of the dealers who had purchased a large collection of other things, knew that, though the man might run him up to a pretty stiff price, he would certainly not buy bibelot at what might prove a loss to himself. He had therefore quite recovered himself, and his intense excitement was somewhat subsiding, and when the nasal tones said again, "And 50, £500, said Valensky quietly. The owner of the nasal tones thereupon shrugged his shoulders and looked up at the ceiling, as if he expected it to give him some sign as to what his next course of action should be. He murmured once more, "And 50, but mechanically and without conviction, and when Valensky said, 600, the nasal tones were heard no more. "Now then, gentlemen," said the auctioneer, "this pair of unique candlesticks going for the sum of £600. £600, gentlemen, going—" 700, came from a musical voice, a lady's. All heads were turned in the direction whence the voice had come, and curious eyes were scanning the new bidder. Valensky did not turn round. He knew well enough whose voice it was. The soft voice with a soupçon of Russian intonation in the pronunciation of the consonants. He had turned deathly pale. His tongue seemed to cleave to the roof of his mouth. His knees began to tremble under him, but in a second all this cowardice was over. Lashing himself into sudden energy, he drew himself bolt upright, and in almost defiant tones shouted to the auctioneer, £1,000! "And 500, came in equally defiant tones from his fair antagonist in the rear. 2,000, said Valensky. "And 500, was the reply. 3,000, 4, 5, 6, £10,000. The crowd, breathless, excited, listened, and alternately gazed at the two bidders, who, from opposite ends of the room, with dry, feverish voices, shouted defiance at each other. Everyone felt that there was some mystery here, some tragedy, the last act of which was being enacted before their eyes. At this point the auctioneer leant forward, and addressing himself more particularly to Valensky, said, "Unless some arrangement is very soon entered into, I cannot keep all these gentlemen waiting. We shall have to proceed with the sale." "Do you hold my bid?" said Valensky. "I said £10,000. "20,000, said Madame Demidoff quietly, as if she were talking of so many pence. £20,000, said the auctioneer, "for a pair of candlesticks. Both this gentleman and this lady are quite unknown to me. I shall have to have some guarantee from both that the money will be paid when the articles are ultimately knocked down, otherwise I must refuse to have the valuable time of these gentlemen taken up any longer. I think some arrangement should be entered into," he repeated again. "In the meanwhile, the last bid of 20,000 holds good." Valensky was about to make an angry retort, for he was boiling over with suppressed excitement, when he felt a hand gently laid on his arm. He turned like an animal at bay and faced the enemy, who certainly at that moment did not seem very formidable. The enemy was beautifully dressed, all in black. It had dark eyes, which looked almost pleadingly into Valensky's wild ones, as if they meant to read what was passing in his thoughts, and it had a voice which spoke with the softest Russian accent he had ever heard. It had, moreover, a tiny hand, exquisitely gloved, which was resting, like a timid bird, on Valensky's coat-sleeve. At last the enemy spoke. "Monsieur," it said in Russian, "we seem to be fighting a terribly fierce battle, you and I. Suppose we have a few moments' armistice. Will you accept the white flag?" Valensky gave a faint nod of acquiescence. "We have, monsieur, you and I, evidently both set our hearts on being possessed of these candlesticks. I wonder if your motive is as pure as my own. Those candlesticks, monsieur, were confided to me by a friend. They were lost while under my charge. I wish to be the one to restore them to him, even if it is to cost me half my fortune." "Madam," replied Valensky, "I honour your motive, but these candlesticks were originally entrusted to my master, the Cardinal, by His Majesty the Emperor himself. They shall be restored to His Eminence, but it shall be through my hands." "Ah," said Madame Demidoff sneeringly, "you wish to claim a reward." "Yes, madame, that is my intention." "Qu'à cela tienne, I will promise you as boundless a reward as His Eminence's munificence could ever dream of, if you will grant me this whim." "Madame, were you to hold in your tiny hand the privy purse of the Tsar of Persia, I would not give up those candlesticks to you." 30,000 for that pair of candlesticks," he shouted to the auctioneer, who, with the crowd, was eyeing the antagonists, curiously straining their ears to catch the meaning of their conversation. "Monsieur," said Madame Demidoff excitedly, "could we not share those candlesticks? Must you have them both?" So extraordinary was this proposal, that for a moment Valensky hardly realized its full meaning. He looked half dazed at the fair Russian, who continued eagerly, "Monsieur, there are 2 candlesticks there. One is slightly damaged, the other quite whole. I will abandon you the one if you will let me have the other. Thus we shall share the honour and glory of presenting the recovered treasures to His Eminence. I suppose, being the lady, I might have the undamaged, therefore superior article?" What was she saying? The undamaged candlestick? He to have the broken one? Why, that was the one that held his papers, and she wished for the other. But then he was saved! Saved! He could not speak, he was too excited. But taking Madame Demidoff's hand, he dragged her through the crowd, who made way for them, to the auctioneer's desk, where the candlesticks were displayed. He said, Yes, I agree. You shall have the one, the best one of the 2. Leave me the broken one. I am satisfied. Why don't you take it? I will pay for them both," he added feverishly, taking a large bundle of banknotes from his pocket-book and forcing them into the hand of the astonished auctioneer. But Madame Demidoff had thrown but one glance at the twin candlesticks, then retreated, her eyes nearly starting out of her head with fear and dismay. The candlesticks were twins indeed, for, in the various vicissitudes through which they had passed in the last few weeks, the arm of the undamaged Cupid had, like its fellow, been chipped from the wrist to the elbow. Madame Demidoff, vainly striving to appear calm, feverishly seized one of the two candlesticks, wildly hoping that luck would favour her in her choice, and left the room, followed by the astonished stare of the spectators, who instinctively made way to allow her to pass with her precious burden. Walensky, who had not noticed the lady's look of dismay, nor realized the cause of it, only saw what he thought was the identical candlestick that contained his secret papers standing there before his very eyes. Hardly crediting his senses, alternating between fear and hope, he took it up and carried it away with him. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Monsieur, I feel sure that the receipt of this letter will cause you no surprise. We are in each other's power. Obviously, it would not answer either of our purposes to fight out this duel. Shall we exchange our pièce de conviction, monsieur, tonight at my hotel, after the walnuts and wine? I dine at 7:30. Yours, Anna Demidoff. Ivan Walensky held the delicately scented little pink note in his hand, and read and re-read it till he knew its brief contents by heart. It was such a strange ending to his terrible adventures of the last fortnight, culminating in that fierce struggle under the auctioneer's desk, and Ivan, who was not 30, and was a man before he became a socialist, thought of that foe whom he had known and dreaded so long, as she stood imploringly by his side, with the tiny gloved hand resting on his coat sleeve. Since that moment he seemed to remember every subsequent event, but as a half-distinct dream. He had grasped the candlestick which he believed held the secret papers with a wild feeling of exultation, and carried it home to his hotel. Once there, and his door securely locked, he had touched the hidden spring, and seen the papers resting within the depths of the receptacle. With trembling hands he took them out, and his aching eyes travelled over them feverishly. Oh, the first feeling of nameless horror when he realized that that writing, those papers, were not the ones he had fought for so valiantly, now, after so bitter a struggle. The hopeless sensation of utter despair that seemed to numb his faculties, and deaden them even to the extent of not realizing the contents of the papers he held in his hands. It was not till fully half an hour afterwards, when he heard Merkovich's heavy step on the stairs, that he succeeded in rousing himself from this strange apathy. The old socialist had tried Ivan's door, but finding it locked had evidently gone away again. Ivan did not want to see him then. He was beginning to think, and think he must alone, in peace, without fear, and with complete calm. Madame Demidoff, the agent of the Russian government, held the papers of the Socialistic Brotherhood. True, but in exchange he, Walensky, held what would brand her before all the world as a spy of the Russian police, and for ever prevent her following that calling again. If made publicly known that her papers had fallen into the wrong hands, her government would, as is customary in such cases, disown their agent, and probably wreak vengeance upon her for her carelessness. Obviously, then, though the Brotherhood was at this moment in Demidoff's power, the fair Russian was equally in the power of the Brotherhood, and... It was at this point of his now calm reflections that the waiter brought Ivan the pink-scented note, which had been left at the hotel for Monsieur Walensky, while the bearer waited for an answer. It was a triumph for Walensky. She had spoken truly. It would not serve either of their purposes to fight out so well-balanced a duel. Madame, tonight at 7:30 o'clock I will wait on you as you graciously bid me, and trust that our enmity, after a mutual laying down of arms, will change into friendship over the walnuts and wine. I am, Madame, your humble and devoted servant, Ivan Walensky. He sent this note down, made a hasty toilet, still purposely evaded his grim comrade, whom he did not wish to meet until he could lay the fateful papers in his hands. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. And that night, in one of the daintily furnished sitting rooms of Claridge's Hotel, before a gazily blazing fire, a man and a woman sat discussing their late mutual adventures over the hunt after the Emperor's candlesticks. They each had handed over to the other the respective compromising papers, and when that was done, each heaved a sigh of relief, and a dainty white hand was stretched out in token of friendship and bond of mutual silence. And the writer has been told, on the surest authority, that this compact has been most faithfully kept, for Lobkowitz and Merkovich never could afterwards induce Ivan Valensky to join them in their numberless plots and plans. Having handed the fateful papers back safely into the keeping of grim old Merkovich, the Brotherhood looked to him in vain for help, and he never once joined in their meetings up the back stairs of the dreary Vienna house. And as for Madame Demidoff, the Russian government had soon to accept her resignation, in view of her approaching marriage. Last winter, at the brilliant ball given by the Princess Marionoff in her palace at St Petersburg, certainly the most admired among all the belles was Madame Valensky, née Demidoff. No one noticed, however, that she and her husband exchanged a meaning smile as the princess displayed to her guests a pair of the rarest Vervienne candlesticks, which, it was discreetly whispered, had been presented to her by His Eminence the Papal Nuncio himself, on behalf of no less a person than His Catholic and Apostolic Majesty Franz Joseph I. End of Chapter 22. Recording by Kevin Green. End of The Emperor's Candlesticks by Emma Orczy.